Hi and welcome to the channel. In this video, I'm going to build a test bench. By the way, this is the first video in a 4-part vlog on how I updated my test bench and editing rig. Anyway, let's start. As for the motherboard, I opted for an MSI B650i Edge Wi-Fi. A few reasons why this motherboard. First is that I wanted an AM5 platform for longevity. Second is that I wanted an ITX motherboard. I could opt for an ATX motherboard as it is cheaper, but I decided to go ITX since one focus of this channel is building SFF PCs. Third is I have no budget for an X670 ITX motherboard. And furthermore, although this became an excuse, I don't need the X feature set. Fourth is that this is the only available B650 ITX motherboard at the time. Anyway, as for the motherboard, it has a warning behind it. Please don't over-tighten the CPU water block to prevent any injury from motherboard components. As AM5 is an LGA, there's a CPU socket cover. I also suggest keeping it covered until you are ready to install your CPU to prevent bending pins. And like any ITX, it only has one PCIe by 16 slot. There's one M.2 slot here behind the heatsink, but for me, I'll utilize the M.2 slot at the back since it will be difficult to access later on. There are RGB, fan headers, USB-C, USB 3, front panel connector that is very far, USB 2, front panel audio, and there are also hidden pins behind the heatsink. Then here on the side is the CPU fan and AIO pump header. One good thing about this motherboard is that there are debug LEDs. As for the rear I.O., there's a BIOS flashback which is nice. The clear CMOS button is here as well. One HDMI port, 5 USB ports, one USB-C, one 2.5G Ethernet port, Wi-Fi 6E antenna outputs, and audio outputs. As for accessories, there is an RGB 3-pin to 4-pin, antennas, manual, screws for the M.2, and stickers which I'm not really a fan of. Moving on, as for the processor, I'll be using the Ryzen 9 7900 Non-X and Non-X 3D. It was a decision for me between this and the 7800X 3D. I opted for this as I wanted cores which I can make use in the future. Or so I thought. In retrospect, I think the right decision is to actually just get the 7800X 3D since the primary use of the CPU is for benchmarking GPUs in games. But I quote-unquote future-proofed the build and would want the 7900 for its cores in the future. Realistically though, it's not going to happen. Inside the box is a big heatsink solution that is supposed to be good enough for this processor. But I'll not be using this since I have an AIO for the test bench. The CPU is here in the black box. It has installation instructions which are pretty much not needed, as installing the CPU is pretty much the same since I am aware of. The CPU has its SMD caps at the top rather than at the bottom, and the likely reason for it is to make its size similar to AM4 and have some of the coolers to be still compatible with AM5. Anyway, to install the CPU, lift the lever of the motherboard, lift the socket retainer, and again, triangle of the CPU to the triangle of the motherboard. In AM5, it seems that the installation is usually upright rather than sideways. Close the retainer, push the lever to lock. The plastic cover will pop out, which is expected. Do keep it as it is required if you're going for warranty. As for the RAM, I went with G.Skill Trident Z5 Neo 32GB 6000 MHz CL36 RAM. One reason for getting G.Skill is that they made it easy to determine if their RAM has an AMD Expo or Intel XMP. G.Skill added the name Neo for Expo compatible RAMs, and those without Neo are for XMP compatible RAMs. In DDR4, Neo and non-Neo didn't really matter, but it seems that it matters in DDR5, as AMD and Intel put in some optimization for DDR5, or at least in this stage. Hopefully in the future, this will not matter as well. I also chose 6000 MHz since based on review, this is the sweet spot for AM5. Looking at the RAM, the design is really sleek in my opinion. Anyway, installing the RAM, open the RAM blocks, put in the RAM in the correct position, and push it until you hear the click sound. As for the storage, I have two SSDs. First is a Samsung 860 EVO 500GB. This contains the OS, and the second one is a Samsung 980 NAND Pro 1TB. This contains my games. Both of these are recycled from my old test bench, by the way. As for the M.2, again, I'm installing it at the back since I will not have access to it later on. And since the screws from the motherboard are not in resealable package, I installed the spare screw into the motherboard. As for the test bench table, I'm going to use the OBT or Open Bench Table. It came in this design which is flat pack. In short, we have to assemble this in a way. The reason why I bought an ATX size bench table even though I'm going to put an ITX motherboard is that in the future, I may want to use an ATX motherboard as a test bench. More of those quote-unquote future-proofing, though it might be unnecessary actually. To assemble, first remove the feet from the main chassis, find the holes at the bottom and screw one foot there, find the holes at the top and screw the other foot there as well. Remove remove the motherboard standoffs from the feet, and since I'm only using an ITX motherboard, I just needed 4 motherboard standoffs. The standoffs are good as it is a push-pin design. As for the power supply, I was going to reuse an old one, which is the Seasonic Prime Titanium 1000 watts, but more story for this later. For PSU installation, I suggest installing the fan facing upwards. Screw the PSU to the feet. At this point, I noticed that the screws provided don't thread with the CPU. The reason is that I used the wrong screw, which I found out while writing this script. I then installed the motherboard to OBT. I also installed the PCIe support. Notice, however, that I got it wrong again. You should put the motherboard standoffs first and then put the PCIe support. I corrected this afterward when I noticed that the GPU seemed too tall for the support. So while fiddling with the build, I felt that the PSU was not secured enough and thought that my PSU was wrong. So I swapped it out with a Seasonic Prime Platinum 1300 watts. As per Seasonic support, they used the same pinouts and so it was an easier swap. But in retrospect, I actually used the wrong screws for the PSU as it should have been this criss-crossed pattern instead. As for 2.5-inch SSD installation, you can install it at the bottom. Just screw it here. Plug the SATA cables to the motherboard and SSD. And don't forget to plug the SATA power connector as well. As for the cooler, I'm going with the Sapphire Nitro Plus S360-8. Inside it has a manual, 2 fans, mounting bracket, and the third fan on the left and the actual AIO itself. Okay, as for the pump alone, you can see that it has 6 cables, which is a lot. To install this, remove the existing mounting brackets from the motherboard, unscrew the included mounting brackets from the AIO, remove the plastic cover from the pump. Since the pump has pre-installed AM4 mounting and it has pre-applied thermal paste, I just installed it directly to the motherboard. Make sure to hold it down and just use your hands to tighten the screw. I also screwed the fans to the radiator and notice that the fans are using a proprietary type of connector and you should plug the included extension cable. The other end of the extension will be plugged to the pump side of cables. Make sure to plug the cables such as SATA connector power as well. Plug the RGB, plug the fan and pump to the motherboard headers. I've put in OBT's mounting brackets for the radiator and screwed it. Did some cable management. I then installed the power and reset switch and plugged the headers to the motherboard. As for post-build comments, for the motherboard, it is really taking its time to boot every time. I'm not sure if this is an AM5 issue or an MSI issue or probably both. As for the cooler, while benchmarking Cinebench R23 for 30 minutes, the CPU temps averaged at 56.72 degrees Celsius with a max temp of 64.4 degrees Celsius, which I think is overall good. As for OBT, I'm actually happy with it as it served its purpose to easily swap GPUs that I'm testing. However, their website UX is bad, or rather I should say non-standard. Usually for cases, they will term the manual as manual rather than how to. And so I didn't really see the manual during build, which is the reason why I made a couple of mistakes. Also, usually the manual is at the bottom of the features, which they didn't have. Adding links at the bottom of the features page would actually help. You could argue that there's already a link at the top, but lo and behold, they do have a link for the mini, and they don't have an excuse not having a link for the manual there. Second, they do actually have QR code for the manual on the flap after opening the package. However, it flew by me as I was really focused on the case already, which fell down. For me, adding it in this sticker would be better as my line of sight is here. Another comment of mine related to their website is that I had a bad buying experience. From their website, I clicked on where to buy, and since I wanted to buy the OpenBenchtable, the reset switch, and the power switch, and so I clicked on order now on the OpenBenchtable. A new tab opened, and since it showed the checkout page already, I went back to the previous tab and clicked on order now for the power button. Lo and behold, I lost my OpenBenchtable order. It took time for me to realize that there is a small cart link at the top which would take you to store.openbenchtable.com. And I find it frustrating that they actually have a proper e-commerce site but decided to make an effort creating a dysfunctional e-commerce mini site instead. They could have just easily linked their e-commerce website directly. Lastly is the price, which I find really expensive. Although overall the Benchtable is really good and serves its purpose. This is also one of the few Benchtables where the power supply is beneath the motherboard, which will save some table space. But for me, who is just an aspiring YouTuber, this is too expensive. Okay, so that's it for part 1. Part 2 is coming out next month. Thanks for watching. Do like or dislike and subscribe for more unboxing and benchmarks. Bye!